Muslim envoy journeying through Russia in 922 AD encountered something that would stay with him forever. Ahmad ibn Fadlan bore witness as Viking warriors carried out intimate rites involving a slave girl before ultimately burning her alive beside the corpse of their fallen leader. His vivid description reads like the plot of a horror film, except every sentence was true. What you're about to uncover comes straight from historical documentation that exposes how the Vikings wielded sexuality as a weapon of conquest, a mechanism for social order, and a gateway into the afterlife. These customs shaped the medieval European landscape and helped forge enduring ideas about power that echo even today. The accounts were so shocking that some scholars initially dismissed them as hostile exaggeration, from public consummations observed by extended families to sexual executions carried out for amusement, from rape used as systematic psychological torment to funerary rites involving human offerings. Viking sexual norms were strategic displays of power engineered to reinforce control, and they would turn the stomachs of modern audiences. The evidence is drawn from sagas, archaeological findings, and first-hand testimonies that paint a picture of a culture where violence and desire were inseparably intertwined. In Viking life, your sexual role could determine whether you thrived as a respected member of society or were condemned as an outcast. Power and dominance dictated every intimate exchange, wielded with the bluntness of a battle axe. Two Norse concepts could quite literally get you killed: aga and raga. These terms were used to insult men seen as sexually passive or effeminate. To be labelled aga was so deeply dishonourable that Viking legal codes permitted murder in retaliation. You could kill a man for suggesting you were submissive in bed and face no legal repercussions whatsoever. This created a brutally strict sexual caste system. The dominant partner, the one who penetrated, maintained social status and masculine respect. The passive partner, on the other hand, forfeited his manhood, his legal protections, his wealth, and his place in the community. In Viking culture, your position during intercourse directly translated into your rank in society. By modern standards, the legal outcomes were beyond absurd. Men accused of playing the passive role could be stripped of their right to bear arms, testify in legal matters, or inherit property. A bad bedroom reputation could literally cost you your identity as a citizen. The Icelandic sagas recount tales of men losing everything because someone gossiped about their performance behind closed doors. Blood feuds were ignited by sexual slander. The saga of Burnt Njal recounts how dozens perished in a vendetta sparked by one man accusing another of being unmanly. In Egil's saga, warriors cross entire countries just to murder someone who cast doubt on their masculinity. Even a faint suggestion of sexual weakness could trigger a chain reaction of killings, and women could weaponize these insults just as effectively. Norse literature tells of wives who destroyed their husband's social standing by openly questioning their prowess in bed. One account in Laxdæla saga features a woman who divorced her husband and publicly shamed him, claiming he was too gentle during sex. This obsession with dominance created a self-perpetuating loop of aggression. Men were pressured to constantly prove their masculinity through acts of violence, which only bred more conflict, requiring even greater demonstrations of control. Sexual force became a disciplinary mechanism. The fear of being branded as weak kept men loyal to the social order and ensured the Viking power hierarchy remained unchallenged. The Vikings didn't just commit sexual violence, they refined it into a method of psychological warfare. They understood that humiliating a man could do more damage than killing him outright. Some sagas describe the klamhug, the shame strike, which involved slashing or stabbing a defeated enemy's buttocks, symbolizing forced penetration. It wasn't random brutality, it was symbolic emasculation designed to brand the victim as conquered in every sense. What made this particularly effective was that the Vikings didn't always need to perform the act. The implication alone could destroy someone's life, but they often didn't stop at suggestion. Defeated leaders and warriors were routinely subjected to ritualized sexual assault, designed to drain them of their masculine energy and transfer it to their captors. The saga of the Volsungs recounts how captured kings were publicly raped to mark their total defeat. In Viking thinking, forcing a man into submission robbed him of his strength and gifted it to the victor. The psychological scars were permanent and intentional. A man who had been violated often couldn't return to his clan with honor. His people would exile him as damaged, no longer a man in the cultural sense. Some victims took their own lives rather than live with the stigma. Others were driven out, wandering in shame as living trophies of Viking superiority. Sexual slavery, too, was scaled into an economic engine. Markets in Dublin and York overflowed with captives marked for intimate exploitation. The sagas describe with chilling indifference how raiders would sort human beings like cattle, with the most beautiful set aside for the warlord's personal enjoyment. The Jomsvikinga saga references Earl Sigurður maintaining a harem of captured Irish women, treating them as disposable playthings. Viking legal systems enforced a two-tier system that makes today's worst inequalities look tame. Free women had strong legal protection from sexual harm, but enslaved women had none. Any freeman could use them, and killing a slave for resisting counted only as a minor offense. According to Icelandic law, raping a freeborn woman carried the death sentence. Raping a slave woman, that earned a fine, roughly equivalent to damaging someone's livestock. The scale of this atrocity is backed by excavation evidence from Dublin, suggesting that as much as 30% of the population were slaves, many trafficked explicitly for sexual exploitation. This system wasn't just about gratification, it was about strategy. Word of Viking sexual cruelty often preceded their ships. Entire villages surrendered, without resistance, hoping to avoid the unspeakable fates that awaited the defiant. The mere threat of Viking assault became a weapon more terrifying than steel. Even Viking marriages were saturated with sexual ritual and public spectacle. Compared to these, reality shows looked like polite dinner parties. Privacy was rare and legally discouraged. The bride's family was expected to observe the couple's first sexual act to confirm that penetration occurred. Without proof of consummation, the union could be annulled and the dowry reclaimed. Imagine being expected to perform sexually while your in-laws watched for legal reasons. The wedding rituals themselves were heavy with explicit meaning. The Michelnis ceremony, where Thor's hammer was placed in the bride's lap, was widely recognized as a fertility rite, with unmistakable phallic overtones. The priest would bless the hammer and pass it around for guests to touch, creating what was effectively a communal sexual rite disguised as religion. Even the removal of the bridal crown by the groom served as a symbolic act, a public announcement that he was about to take her virginity. This all took place before the gathered witnesses, who would then accompany the couple to the marriage bed. Religious figures and relatives would bless the bed using fertility incantations that amounted to sacred, ritualized, dirty talk. The act of consummation itself occurred while family members stood outside the door, listening for any indication that the union had been completed. The following morning, blood-stained sheets were inspected and publicly displayed as evidence of the bride's virginity and the successful sealing of the marriage. These sheets were often kept as legal records that could be presented in court if the marriage's legitimacy was ever challenged. In certain instances, trusted family members were even present in the room during the consummation to provide first-hand confirmation. The saga of Grettir the Strong tells of a wedding where the bride's uncle stayed in the room to ensure the deed was carried out. Imagine your Uncle Mike standing by as you sleep with your wife. The legal consequences were no joke. If the bride was not a virgin, her family could face lawsuits for deception. If the groom was unable to perform, the bride's kin could request restitution for defective goods. The Icelandic legal texts listed specific penalties for various sexual shortcomings on the wedding night, creating a legal structure that treated intimacy as a contractual business deal. These customs revolved entirely around land, inheritance, and political agreements. The emotions of the couple were secondary, dwarfed by the legal and financial stakes tied to their sexual performance. Love was considered an indulgence, a luxury Viking society rarely had room for when dowries and bloodlines were on the line. Ahmad ibn Fadlan's account reads like the most chilling anthropological document ever recorded. His description of Viking funerals was so disturbing that scholars spent generations trying to discredit him. But archaeology has since confirmed most of what he described. When a Viking chief died, his funeral turned into a multi-day sexual ritual intended to channel life energy from the living into the afterlife. The Norse believed that sexual vitality could be transmitted through physical intimacy and offered to the deceased. Ibn Fadlan describes this process with an almost detached precision. The tribesmen would ask the chief's female slaves, "Who among you will die with him?" One would step forward, convinced that she would join her master in Valhalla as his eternal companion. What followed makes today's horror films seem mild. In her final days, the chosen slave girl engaged in intimate acts with numerous men from the community. She was treated as a consecrated vessel, her body serving to carry the tribe's collective essence into the afterlife. The men would whisper to her, "Tell your master that I did this out of love for him." They genuinely believed they were transmitting spiritual power to the chieftain through her. The ritual intensified with each passing day. Ibn Fadlan writes how the girl was given escalating amounts of alcohol and intoxicants while being handed from man to man. Every encounter was believed to add more spiritual energy to be delivered to the dead. On the day of the funeral, the girl was brought to the ship and subjected to final sexual acts with 6 men, each symbolizing a different force of tribal strength. Ibn Fadlan's description turns clinical at this point. 6 men entered the tent, and each had intercourse with her. Then she was laid beside her deceased master. The climax of the ritual involved the slave girl being strangled with a rope, while simultaneously being stabbed by an elderly woman known as the Angel of Death. The funeral ship was then set on fire as the tribe chanted over the flames, believing they were sending their chief into the next world fueled by sexual power. Modern archaeology has confirmed much of this grim practice. The Oseberg ship burial in Norway contained 2 female remains, one of whom showed signs of a violent end. Other graves across the Norse world contain young women buried alongside powerful men, often with evidence suggesting ritual execution. The Vikings believed this was the ultimate honor, that the slave girl was transformed into a divine escort, carrying the soul and strength of the tribe into the afterlife. But from a modern perspective, it stands out as one of the most systematized forms of sexual violence, cloaked in the garments of religion. Viking culture crafted a paradox that would baffle both modern feminists and conservative thinkers alike. Free Viking women enjoyed legal rights centuries ahead of the rest of medieval Europe, while enslaved women were subjected to levels of brutality that would horrify even the darkest corners of history. Freeborn Norse women could divorce their husbands for sexual inadequacy almost as easily as one returns a faulty product. If a man couldn't satisfy his wife, lacked stamina, or was seen as too soft in his demeanor, she had the legal grounds to leave and take her property with her. Women could inherit land, operate businesses, and even propose marriage to the men they fancied. The saga of the people of Laxedal tells of the deep-minded, who held vast estates and arranged marriages for male relatives. Some women amassed wealth as traders and ship owners, commanding routes and influencing commerce. The sagas speak of women who ended marriages over a man's appearance or lack of honor. Halgafur from Enjal's saga left her husband for wearing a shirt that exposed too much of his chest, declaring it unmanly and therefore unacceptable. Free women also had strong protections from sexual advances. Norse law clearly punished unwanted touching, kissing, or intercourse with severe penalties, including banishment or even death. Consent was a legally acknowledged concept for free women, a concept unheard of in most of medieval Europe. But this forward-thinking approach had a grim underbelly that revealed the true priorities of Viking society. These protections only applied to free women. Enslaved women were treated as possessions, legally exploitable by any free man. The very legal codes that shielded noble women's autonomy made it clear that slaves were tools to be used as their owners pleased. The contrast was deliberate and cruel. By granting free women unprecedented rights, Viking law emphasized just how dehumanizing slavery was. Freedom was sacred, and bondage was the ultimate degradation. A free woman's right to reject unwanted advances made the lack of rights for enslaved women even more glaring. Viking women were not passive bystanders in their society's violence. Archaeological digs at sites like Birka indicate that some women took up arms as warriors, and the sagas recount women who urged their male kin to commit acts of sexual brutality against their foes. They clearly understood that their own freedoms depended on upholding the very system that kept others in chains. While adult Viking women could achieve notable rights, infant girls often faced grim fates if their families couldn't afford to raise them. The sagas mention, almost casually, how fathers would abandon unwanted daughters, leaving them exposed to the elements or to wild beasts. This fostered a culture where a small elite of free women held real influence, while the vast majority of females lived under brutal oppression. Viking views on same-sex relations created a tangled hierarchy so intricate it required legal interpretation to fully understand. Homosexuality itself wasn't outlawed, as long as one followed strict rules about sexual dominance. The sagas speak of warriors who traveled far and wide, seeking sexual exploits with both sexes. The saga of Eric the Red even describes men who kept both wives and male companions, seeing sexual conquest as a status symbol. So long as a man maintained the dominant, penetrating role, his behavior was not only tolerated, but often admired. Even Norse gods were caught in this web of sexual politics. Loki was constantly ridiculed for taking female forms and even giving birth, including to Odin's eight-legged horse, Sleipnir. Odin, for his part, was criticized for practicing seether, a magical art traditionally associated with women. The pros. Edda mentions how other gods questioned Odin's manhood for participating in activities considered feminine. The use of seether illustrates how gender and sexuality overlapped in Viking thinking. Men who practiced this magic were branded pia, sexually deviant due to their adoption of female roles. Yet these men were also feared for their mystical abilities, creating a contradiction. The most magically powerful men were often viewed as sexually suspect. Viking law addressed these views with its characteristic detail. While same-sex intimacy wasn't explicitly forbidden, falsely accusing someone of being sexually submissive was considered a grave offense. Norse legal codes show that insults suggesting passivity carried heavier penalties than many acts of physical violence. Men who displayed feminine traits through clothing, behavior, or sexual roles risked complete social ruin. The pressure to assert masculine dominance infiltrated every level of Viking life. From fashion choices to professions to spiritual practices, this obsession shaped everything. The Vikings turned acts of sexual violence into public spectacles with the flair of modern-day reality television. Their justice system emphasized performance as much as punishment, crafting a legal culture that doubled as grotesque theater. Offenders found guilty of sexual crimes were punished with methods meant to shame them in the same way they had violated their victims. A rapist might be publicly violated before execution, with cheering onlookers viewing the ordeal as a kind of poetic justice. Adulterers could be castrated in front of crowds who treated the punishment like a competitive sport. These sentences weren't just about retribution. They also reinforced the social ladder through ritualized humiliation while offering entertainment for the public. These gruesome public punishments made power dynamics unmistakably clear. Meanwhile, they provided a socially acceptable outlet for the Vikings' taste for graphic brutality. The sagas even describe festivals where sexual violence was part of the planned activities. Captured enemies were forced to engage in humiliating acts for the crowd's amusement, with spectators placing bets on how long the victims would endure different kinds of sexual torment. The saga of the Jomsvikings recounts contests in which prisoners were subjected to escalating degrees of sexual degradation until they either died or went mad. Archaeological digs support these accounts with unsettling regularity. Execution sites often show signs of elaborate mutilation far beyond simple killing, suggesting that sexual humiliation was a built-in feature of the punishment, not a side effect. This normalization of sexual cruelty as entertainment goes a long way toward explaining how Viking raiders carried out such large-scale atrocities during their invasions. They weren't acting outside their cultural norms. They were following a well-established code that glorified these acts. Sexual violence wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated, transformed into a form of grim performance art. Viking civilization built a world where sexuality, authority, and aggression fused together like the parts of a finely forged blade. These behaviors were not random or impulsive. They were deliberate systems of control, using sexuality as a strategic method to enforce hierarchy and submission. What might appear today as raw savagery was, for them, a structured process, one that reshaped medieval Europe and echoes into our present through genetics, legal frameworks, and ideas of masculinity that still linger. The Viking legacy didn't stay confined to Scandinavia. It spread across continents, carrying with it complex ideologies about sex, power, and dominance to every land they touched. What other civilizations' sexual customs would shock modern audiences? Let me know in the comments which culture you'd like me to explore next.